think my hair is that shocking. It's like a nice muted blue. But, but yeah, as she said, I'm going to talk primarily today about building conversational interfaces for the enterprise. We've talked a lot today about designing your bot's voice and tone, as well as how to design interactions that work really well. But what's really unique about developing work is that there's a lot of special considerations. Since all of you are at ChatbotConf, you probably already know how to design for a social bot. And you might have thought about designing for an enterprise bot as well, but it's still a fairly niche thing. So let's start off by talking about what are the specific corporate quirks that you have to keep in mind when you're designing an enterprise bot. Well, first of all, as Ashley from Poncho alluded to just in her last talk, there's a lot of multi-party interactions that you have to think about. In a typical social bot, you're really engaging in a one-on-one conversation with just the user and the bot itself. So a lot of those conversations are single-threaded, and you can really build your conversation off of that. But in workplace chat platforms like Slack, but also Microsoft Teams and the other ones out there, there's a lot of places, like public channels, where you're actually working with multiple users at a time. And you have to think about, how do I interact with these multiple users, given that they may be saying multiple things to me at the same time? And that can be a really hard flow to design for. Additionally, apps are installed by one user for the entire team. So you really have to think about, like, how do I engage with a user that has my app installed for them, but may not really understand what that app is just yet? The next is, in a work setting, there's really a huge emphasis on utility. That's not a surprise. People are there to work, so they want your app to help them do work well. And in that sense, there's really an emphasis on utility rather than simple pleasantries. And lastly, there's many more ways to interact on a work platform than there is on a social platform. Platforms like Messenger, like Kik, like Telegram also have things like buttons and menus and lists. But on a workplace platform like Slack, there's also things like slash commands, like dialogues, a new feature that we just came out with, where it pops you up this whole new menu that you can type in structured data to the app for, and as well as different events that can trigger app behavior. So there's really a lot more room for interactivity, and you can really fold that into your bot's behavior. So something I'm going to talk about a little later is that the best way to really design a great bot is to know your audience well. Let's talk a little bit about what the enterprise bot user looks like. For Slack, this means that we have about 6 million daily active users, and that comes from a really diverse set of teams. They not only come from the tech space, like you might expect, but they're also in the retail sector, they're in media, they're in telecom, they're in professional services, and a lot more other industries. And 90% of our paid teams actually already use apps, which is huge. That's the potential size of your market and the potential diversity of it as well. And we already have over 1,000 apps in our app directory in categories such as productivity, sales, etc. You can see the whole list on our app directory website. And these apps include things like Twitter, like DataFox. These bring notifications straight into your team, but also things like Zenefit's PTO bot, so people can actually use a conversational bot and interact with it to request their paid time off and have their managers actually approve that process, all within Slack. Additionally, we have apps like Wunderlist, Lyft, and it's really a whole variety. But what all of these apps have in common is that they essentially design their apps to work in that enterprise setting. And what that means is having that bot act like it's a really great employee of the company. And that's, I think, the mindset that the most successful bots really go in with. So we'll talk today about how to do that, starting with talking about how to make sure your bot makes a good first impression when it meets the company and when it gets installed. Also, then we'll discuss how to make sure your bot works efficiently itself, as well as helps others on the team do their work better, faster. And lastly, we'll discuss how to design your bot's tone and brand so that it works well in that enterprise setting, keeping a little bit of the characteristic bot fun, but also appropriate for the workplace. So let's start by talking about first impressions. This is an area that's, like I said, especially important for the enterprise setting for a couple of reasons. First off, if you've ever worked in a large company, you know it's extremely hard to get new software approved because there's often like a vendor process. They work with the IT team to ensure that the app is secure, and then there's a whole admin process where someone has to install the app for you. This is true for those larger teams, and so it's important that when people see your app and read about it in the first place, they really understand its functionality, and it gets them over the hump of this is pretty interesting, to this is good enough that I want to go through our software procurement process to bring it in for my team. The next thing that's really unique to software apps for the workplace is that a lot of companies are really protective about their data. So they'll be really curious to know why you're using certain scopes, and especially for a conversational bot, why you'd want to access your team's conversation. And so bringing out as much of your functionality as possible in the beginning lets them know that your app is secure and lets them know why you'd want to access your data in this way. And so it's really important to essentially display your value up front. This is what our app directory looks like with some information about your app, both either on the web or actually in the app itself. And in here, you can see there are places for screenshots, for videos, for a long description, as well as what / commands that app can do. And so this really showcases the full variety of your app's behavior and compels people to install it. Your app might say, for instance, that it's a design app, right? It's InVision. But what does that mean for InVision app? You know that InVision has a huge product lineup, but what parts of it are they bringing in? Is it a conversational bot? Do I get notifications? And honestly, the simplest way to answer that question is just by showing them how it works, whether that's with a video that shows the full experience or just a couple of images that really illustrate and drive home that behavior. This, like I said, is also where users will be able to truly tell the full functionality of your app. So if they're curious about why you're asking for a scope that reads their emoji reactions, they'll know right here because, hey, now they see that there's, for instance, an emoji reaction mechanism for polling. And so that really puts their minds at ease. So now let's say you've cleared that hurdle. You've managed to get your app actually installed on the team. Then actually comes the hard part, because this is when people will start using your app. And it's really important to have a great onboarding experience right here and say hello to the installing user. This means telling them and reiterating what your app does, how it can access those specific pieces of functionality, and really importantly, how to find help in the future. By putting all of this text right there, you're encouraging that installing user to actually go forth and take that first step to interact with your app. Otherwise, they might forget that they've ever installed it, or they'll be confused about where to find help if they don't need it for a while, want to come back to use it for the first time, and have no idea how. This is also really important because, like I said, apps in the workplace are often installed by one user, but used across the whole team. So if someone else on my team has just installed Polly a couple weeks ago, and I see that it's a new bot user that's on the team, how do I know how to interact with it? This is a really great place for you to know that, hey, Helen sent me a DM for the first time. I might have sent Polly something like hi or test just to see what it would do. And it can give me the same message back to say, hey, I'm Polly. Again, I see that you're new here. You've never used me before. These are all my features. This is what I can do, and this is how you can interact with me. And this is something that seems small, but is really key to driving your adoption across the whole team. So you're not just used by 1 or 2 users across the team. You're used by the entire team all at once. And it really helps make your application sticky in the end. If your app requires some sort of setup to do, I'm really happy that this GIF is working. I was really worried. I saw that might not have been true. But as you can see here, you can really guide users through the setup process if there needs to be some setup. For example, Growbot is an app that really only works the best when it's in a channel, which means the installing user usually has to install the app, but add it to a public channel, and then teach other users how to do it. That tends to be quite a few steps, and it can be a little bit cumbersome to ask someone to do all these things. So they did a really good job of actually guiding a user through this, not only in the DM with them when it's installed, but also having them do all that setup process right then and there. They're using one of our features that's called a channel picker, so the user can actually pick from an existing list of channels on the team, and then the bot will just invite itself to there, which shortcuts quite a few clicks on the user's side. And then, after that's done, Growbot actually will say, hey, do you want me to introduce myself to that channel so everyone there knows how to use me? What their app does is you basically do an emoji reaction when you see someone has done a great job, and then everyone else can sort of pile on and give kudos to that person. So it's a really social activity, and there's a lot of coaching involved. But as you can see here, they are really explicit in asking the user to let them set themselves up in that channel every step of the way. And it makes that user feel like Growbot really cares about them and cares about the setup process. Also, frankly, this is really important to have in that DM because, again, a user might install the app from the web, see that it's on their team, but not have time to think about what channels it wants to invite it to right away. And if the setup is in the DM with the bot, they can always go back to it and pick up right where they started last time. And again, drive that adoption across the whole team. So we talked about how to onboard your bot, how to introduce itself to the team, how to make sure everyone knows what its functionality is. Let's talk about workflows, because this is when work is actually getting done. So how do you work efficiently, and how do you build workflows that allow every member of the team to use your app really well and shortcut all the huge steps that they had to do before? First things first, a lot of bots start off with notifications, especially in the corporate world. Hey, you have a new task to do in our system. Someone wants you to approve something. And all of these are really cool to bring into Slack because they turn out to be these 1 or 2 click interactions that they can now do in the span of a second or two. But nevertheless, these are, in the end, interruptions. So you want to make these interruptions as meaningful as possible. Because no one wants to receive 10 push notifications on their phone, only to realize that, for example, I have this notification, it tells me I need to do something, now I need to log into that separate software, do a couple of clicks there, and then come back. So you can actually bring in the workflow directly into the message itself with something like message buttons. And you can do something simple like starting survey, declining it, like you see here. But something that's really cool that we've seen is people integrating a snooze functionality into notifications. Because an app like Slack is not just installed on the desktop, and it's not just being used at work. Often things are happening even when you're at home, when you're out and about, when you're basically using your phone. And sometimes it's just not the right time for you to finish this workflow right now, but you do want to come back to it later. And you can build in this mechanism pretty easily, either on your end or using our Reminders API. As you can see here, we've shown the interface both on the web and on mobile side by side to really highlight that the same message text can be displayed differently on mobile and on desktop. So it's important to always look at how this message is being formatted in both platforms. And this is something that we've occasionally seen as an issue because someone will say, okay, in a notification, you want to know as much as possible. Let me give you this much text on desktop. But that actually turns out to be this much text on mobile. And no one wants such a long notification. No one wants to scroll a couple of times just to see the whole thing. And so always test on mobile. And lastly, we should talk, when we're talking about notifications, we need to talk about badging, and in particular, how mentions work in Slack. When you mention someone, it'll actually send them a push notification. And when you use something like an @here or an @channel, that sends a notification to everyone on that channel or everyone who's online at that time. So those are things that can be really useful if you want to get someone's attention, but use those very sparingly, and only in cases where you actually need everyone to be all hands on deck. Because otherwise, your app can slowly turn noisy, and people might actually turn off the notification settings and not gain the benefits that they otherwise would. Sort of along those lines, it's really great to be able to provide help in context. because you don't want to be intrusive, but you want to be helpful if you can. So this is an example of what the Salesforce app does. It sees that someone has used a Salesforce link, and it helpfully pastes that information that's from the link right in line. So this example is for a Salesforce opportunity, which, it's like, who's the account, how much is the size of the opportunity, what stage is it at? And if you're in a conversation where you're talking about this opportunity with a couple of people, it's helpful to just have that information right there instead of making every single person click out, see the information, come back, and talk about it. And this is one of those really small delights that your app can provide, because the user might not ever know that the functionality exists until the first time they're pasting a Salesforce link, and they're like, oh, hey, this is great. This is actually the information I was going to copy and paste over for everyone else. And with our app unfurls feature, which this showcases, you can also add something like buttons and menus inline as well, so people can get progressively more information if they need to. If you are building a conversational interface, so talking back and forth with a bot, in a workplace setting, it's really good to make those conversations as simple and as straightforward as possible. So this is kind of a demo example of a coffee bot that folks on my team built, and all it does is it asks you for your coffee order. But as we all know, there's like a million ways you can ask for coffee and a million different coffee orders that you can ask for. A bot won't understand all of them. And so it's easy to just give your users the choice of what your bot can do, especially if there's a limited set, and have users choose from them in a list form. What alternative milks do you have? Like, if you don't have coconut milk or cashew milk, don't show it in there. And that way, everyone knows exactly what their choices are. And it also makes the interaction a lot simpler and less error-prone. You don't have to worry about typos because people can really only click. And users appreciate not having to type out everything that they're thinking. And if people are going through and having the same interactions over and over again, for instance, ordering a coffee, it's good to actually just give them smart defaults that they can choose from. So people really appreciate when you remember things about them. Whether that's your barista remembering your favorite coffee order at the coffee place you always go to, or in a workplace setting, remembering that you don't want to send notifications every time you're uploading a file. It's just good to save them those little pockets of time, because that's how your app can really, really shine. On an individual level, instead of just having the same preferences for the entire team. And lastly, something that I think people are really, there's a misunderstanding that when we're building out all these interactivity features in Slack, that we essentially want you to bring your entire web app into Slack and do everything from Slack and no longer have a web interface. That's simply not true. What we really want is to, again, help remove those tiny frictions in your workplace life. So if there's interactions that you're doing for 1 or 2 minutes at a time, those are the really key tasks we want you to bring into Slack. So a good example is this dialogues feature that Rike, which is a task management tool, is integrating with. So someone can use a / command. It'll actually bring up this menu, and they can type in all the things that they would have typed in to create a task in the web interface itself, except they can just do it right here. It doesn't use, this captures the sort of 80% of the 1 to 2 minute tasks, but for those larger tasks, we still do want people to use your app, because in the end, there are features that you're going to build on your side that will simply never match up on our side, and we understand that. So just the 80% is great for us, and being able to do those 1 or 2 minute tasks in Slack helps your users and helps our users as well. And after you're doing all of these tasks, after you have all these interactions, it's really important to clean up after yourself and really make that summary text good and streamlined. This is something that I think the ability to edit a message after the fact like this is something that's primarily available in enterprise chat applications, but it really shouldn't be overlooked, because this is something that people can always look back to for a summary, especially if you're doing something like an approval workflow or anything where the user is doing a series of tasks. When they're searching back in the conversation history later, they know exactly what happened, exactly who did what. And importantly, if users have already chosen an action or a button has been unused for a while and gets stale, you can clean up after that so that no one clicks a button from a year ago, puts your app in a bad state, gets confused about what's happening. And this is something that's also really great to do as a bonus if you're sending multiple notifications in a row. If you're sending in like 5 notifications that a file has been updated in various ways, you can, in the end, collapse that after a minute or two. Just say, hey, there have been 5 edits on this particular document. And that just makes that conversation history with the bot really clean. So now we've talked about how to be or how to make your interactions really, really shine in Slack in these small ways. But a lot of the true delights from your app don't just come from the utility of it. It comes from those small details, and it comes from really having your brand voice shine. And in Slack, for us, this translates into really being thoughtful and being kind in all your interactions, even if you are just a bot. And the first step to doing this really well is actually understand your audience. For us, the average team size and the maturity can really have a huge impact on how those teams expect your app to behave. On a smaller team who is more agile with their Slack usage, they might prefer to have a lot of conversation in public channels, and they might be okay with an app being noisier because they tend to be noisy. But on like a 10-person team like IBM, posting in a huge public channel is kind of a big no-no. And actually, at Slack ourselves, where we're just about 1,000 people now, posting in the general channel is already kind of like a you need to be careful kind of thing. So this really ramps up quickly, and understanding your team size or your average team size can really help you understand how your app should behave to match the expectation of your audience. The next is understanding sort of the differentiated user roles that you can see in an enterprise setting. We released something quite recently called shared channel, where you can have one channel shared between 2 teams. And that means that there's a lot of users that can now potentially see and interact with an app that don't belong on your primary team. Now, we'll tell you who those users are, but it's your app's responsibility to handle that in a responsible way, so that if you're a sales app for a BD app and there's a partnership channel, you're not letting the other team accidentally query for potentially sensitive information and cause some sort of data leak. There's also guest users that are on a team as well, and they also need restricted access. So it's just good to cover all of these seemingly small edge cases that will really matter, especially to an enterprise audience. And even within a team itself, there's a lot of different access roles. If you're an HR app, the HR team should be able to, for instance, maybe do some read and write access to your data. But everyone else on the team should be able to access data, but perhaps not modify it. And for doing things like that, you'll want to build a second layer of authentication so that the users on your system are matched with the users on our system, and they have the same access roles in both. And lastly, you should consider your expected users' familiarity with apps, or especially Slack apps. For some industries, there's just simply not a lot of apps out there, and they might have on average, like a little bit lower technical aptitude. So when you're catering to these types of audiences, it's really important to be as overactive and proactive as possible in communicating how an app works. Even something like a slash command might be familiar to all of us because we've used IRC back in the day, but if you're talking to a less technical audience, they might even need an example of exactly what a slash command looks like. And just providing that in context can be really helpful. And once you've understood your audience, you can really start reflecting that in your brand and in your app's voice. This is a little contrived of an example here called Cowgirl Cooker, but this really illustrates the importance of having a little bit of fun with it, but not so much fun that it actually causes confusion. For instance, you want to add in a little yippee-ki-yay to show that it's your brand, you're a cowgirl, but mixing up the actual intent or call to action in the buttons and in the text can be confusing because there's simply too much jargon involved. So especially when you're doing something like buttons, always be using an overactive voice and have an action verb in that in that button text instead of something that's like fun but perhaps confusing. An intent and decline button is always more preferable to something like an EHAW intonations, but it's actually also preferable to something like a yes and a no. Just being as explicit as possible will always pay off. And a fun brand isn't actually necessary for building a bot. I know that's like kind of crazy to say here, but especially in the enterprise setting, if you're already building an app that's quite serious and meant for something like Salesforce, it's not necessarily, you don't have to build in a fun bot character. Instead, you should just be true to your own brand in the end. And as you're writing the copy for your bot, you want to keep in mind that you should be as clear and concise in the end, as human as possible. I think a lot of people, when they're first designing their bot voices for Slack or for an enterprise setting, they're still in the mindset of like, how do I craft this message in a way that a bot would say it? But here's the thing, you should craft the message like it's something your company would actually say. And you should aim to be as clear in that messaging as possible, rather than being as fun as possible. Because utility over everything is the key here. So you can pepper in a little like howdy partner in the beginning, again, as a greeting, and use that overactive action verb in the button text, but don't throw in a whole joke in there. And especially don't throw in a whole joke in there and then having the actual call to action at the very end, where it's easily missed. And when you're thinking about being considerate in your app behavior, this doesn't only extend to the copy itself, it also extends to that app behavior. So something that's really common for apps to do is actually querying for data. So for example, the Salesforce app, again, has a behavior where you can do a / command and query for a certain account. Now, that kind of function can be used in quite a few different contexts. For one, once this circles back again, Bruce could be mentioning a company, Big Co. And as a user, you might either say, like, oh, I don't know who Big Co is. Let me look them up real quick with this query function. In which case, the Salesforce app will actually return that result only visible to you, the user who's just issued that command. In that way, you can get all the details without looking like you're not necessarily in the loop. On the other hand, you might be using this query functionality to give the broader team all context into exactly what this company is and what the opportunity size is, so you can start a larger discussion around it. And in that use case, we actually have at the end of the message that's just to the installing user, or just to the user that called the / command, we have this button that says post to conversation. So then this message actually becomes public to everyone who's seeing it. And as the app itself, you won't be able to tell in the moment what behavior a user might want at that very moment. So it's good to just provide a user an option and default to being quiet in the channel whenever you can. Because if you embarrass a user even just once, they'll be too scared to use that app again, and that is definitely not what you want. And lastly, you should always sweat the small stuff when you're thinking about app behavior and how to design your copy. Small things like using they or their as your pronouns instead of she or her or he and his can be really important and make everyone feel included. Similarly, you can consider using a variety of emoji skin tones. Emojis, I think, are still a big part of Slack culture and a big part of bot culture, but doing small things like this does make everyone feel included. And Slack's audience is actually, over 50% of Slack's users are actually not in North America, so they're spread across the world. So it's really important to represent them, but also cater to them. And in that way, avoid using jargon and slang as much as you can. It's good to be funny once in a little while, but for those things that really require action, being clear over using jargon can be key. And lastly, like I've said many, many times before, make sure that your buttons are concise and they're active, and so that users can click sort of with confidence in your app's functionality. So we've talked a lot about the different tips and tricks that you can do. And if you're interested, I can definitely talk about this afterwards. But there's, in the end, like 3 things that you have to really remember. And it's all about being able to provide that good balance between fun and work, and making sure that your bot acts exactly like some good coworker on your team would. So make a great first impression by letting users know how to use your bot and why they should use your bot. Then aim to just make your users' working lives easier with things like smart defaults, action notifications, contextual help whenever they need it. And lastly, reflect your brand and your audience in your bot's voice, tone, and character. Instead of trying to make it fun, make it authentic to your actual brand. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, if anyone has questions, I'd love to answer them.
Yes, Helen's ready for your questions. I saw a hand a second ago. Oh, no, okay. Well, don't worry about it. Go, feel free, and when you feel the need. I love what you said just now about sweat the small stuff. It's really those little details, I think, that make a difference between something feeling easy and natural and clear. I think that's something that we've touched on a few times now, but yeah. I think with Slack it's a little bit more poignant because of the workplace atmosphere, right? How many here use Slack or have used Slack? Okay, and you don't have any questions for this woman? Seriously? Like, don't you want to even try out making your own app for your specific company needs? Come on, you guys. There's got to be a question out there, or you were just so
this
clear.
This guy has a question.
Oh, I see you. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the great presentation, and Slack is great. So thank you. Who doesn't use Slack? What I like with Slack is a way to combine private, direct messaging and public channels. That's really great and unique. 2 questions. What about voice support and Slack? And the second question, you mentioned that app developers should implement some kind of second layer authentication that would map Slack identities into client identities, but still bot would need some kind of authorization token that would provide bot access to backend data. Is there a solution for that within Slack?
Yeah, so for the first question, does Slack have a voice feature yet? And the answer is no. And it's something that we get asked quite often, but it's something that's quite hard to build. And so no official word on that yet. But for actual signing in and deeper authentication, we do have a couple of things that we recommend. The first is our sign in with Slack button. So this works the same as like a sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google, sign in with Twitter, where you can actually get an identity token for that specific user so that you know with confidence that that is a Slack user on our side, and then you can match it up to the user on your side. And then we also have an example for doing sort of that same kind of authentication with a nonce token. And this is what Trello does and what PagerDuty does in their apps, where essentially you give them a link to click. They click in that link. If they're already signed in on the browser, then you can automatically match the two because you know which user you sent that link to and who they are on your system. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes. Come in 1 second.
Thank you. My question was, so we're developing our bots on Slack, and the issue that we have sometimes is that, for example, we would like to display the Google Calendar in a better way, or we would like to highlight a word in red, or do a different kind of text. So I understand that specifically for apps, changing the way that you can design on Slack would not make sense because it's your brand. So I guess my question would be, is Slack trying to maybe redesign a little bit their text and the way that they show information?
What a good and timely question. So we actually have our developer roadmap online on Trello. If you search for Slack developer roadmap, it shows everything that we want to do near term, midterm, and long term. And considering how the additional formatting in a text for an app is something that we're actually doing right now. So no hard answers yet. This is something that'll probably come in the midterm, but thinking through how can we help people display things like lists, like a graph, like a chart, like different colored text. It's all sort of up in the air right now, but something that we do want to explore. Yeah, look out for it.
Okay, we can take one more question if anyone has a pressing one. And otherwise, I think Helen's going to be around. She's right?
Yes.
She's ready to answer all other, if they're more, sensitive questions you don't want to ask in public. So Helen will be around. Thank you so much, Helen. This was fascinating. Thanks, everybody. Give Helen a big hand.
Thank you.
So much.